During lunch, my parents casually told me they gave our family business to my brother. Dad smiled and said, "Don't get emotional, Claire. You'll always have a place here," like I was furniture. I walked out and let it all collapse. The moment those words left his mouth, I felt like I'd been physically struck. My fork clattered onto my plate as the blood drained from my face. Around the restaurant table, my extended family continued their conversations, oblivious to the bombshell that had just detonated in front of me. My mother was nodding approvingly at Dad's announcement, as if they'd just told me about a weekend barbecue plan instead of signing away everything I'd built over the past 8 years. Always have a place here. The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. What kind of place exactly? The same invisible position I'd occupied for years, working 75-hour weeks without a title, managing every critical client relationship, while Jacob showed up late to meetings and checked his phone during presentations. I looked at my younger brother, who was already scrolling through his phone, completely disinterested in the family business he'd just inherited. My initial shock quickly transformed into something much more dangerous. Cold, calculated analysis. This wasn't an emotional reaction anymore. This was strategic assessment. I began mentally cataloging everything I knew that they didn't realize I knew. Every client relationship, every vendor contract, every operational procedure that kept their company functioning. They had just handed Jacob the keys to a machine he didn't understand, and they expected me to keep running it from the shadows. But why should I? For the first time in my adult life, I started thinking about what would happen if I simply stopped. If I stopped answering the 6 a.m. calls from panicked clients. If I stopped staying late to fix Jacob's mistakes. If I stopped being the invisible foundation that held up their entire operation. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I stood up from that table with a strange sense of clarity washing over me. "You want Jacob to run this company?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "Then let him." I walked out of that restaurant without another word, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of their expectations lift off my shoulders. What my family didn't understand was that they had just made the most catastrophic business decision in the company's 25-year history. Not because Jacob was incompetent, though he was, but because they fundamentally misunderstood what I brought to the organization. They saw me as the reliable workhorse who kept things running smoothly. They had no idea I was actually the strategic brain that had been driving their growth for nearly a decade. My background wasn't just in operations. I held an MBA in supply chain management from Northwestern and had spent 3 years at McKinsey before joining the family business. I'd initially planned to stay for 2 years to help modernize their systems, but I'd gotten pulled deeper into the operational side when I realized how much potential they were wasting. Over 8 years, I had systematically rebuilt their entire business model from the ground up. I was the one who negotiated their exclusive distribution agreement with Midwest Industrial Supply, their largest client representing 40% of annual revenue. I designed the inventory management system that reduced waste by 23% and improved delivery times by 35%. I established relationships with their top 15 clients personally, attending their company events, remembering their executives' names and family situations, becoming their trusted point of contact. Most importantly, I had developed the operational procedures manual that turned their chaotic family business into a streamlined, profitable enterprise. Financially, I was in a much stronger position than my family realized. My McKinsey salary and bonuses had allowed me to accumulate $180,000 in savings, which I had invested conservatively in a diversified portfolio now worth approximately $240,000. I owned my downtown condo outright, worth $195,000, and drove a paid-off vehicle. I had been living well below my means specifically because I was planning to eventually start my own consulting firm once I finished learning everything I could from the family business. My strategic advantages were overwhelming. First, I possessed intimate knowledge of their client base. including confidential information about contract renewal dates, pricing structures, and relationship dynamics that Jacob had never bothered to learn. Second, I had cultivated personal relationships with key decision-makers at their major accounts, relationships built on trust and proven results that couldn't be transferred to someone else overnight. Third, I understood their operational vulnerabilities better than anyone because I had been personally managing them for years. Fourth, I had maintained extensive documentation of every major project, every client interaction, and every strategic decision, giving me an unmatched perspective on what worked and what didn't. But my most significant advantage was my professional network. During my years managing client relationships, I had built connections throughout the industry. I knew which suppliers offered the best terms, which logistics companies were most reliable, and which consultants specialized in market expansion. I had maintained relationships with former McKinsey colleagues who were now senior executives at major corporations. I even had contacts at competing firms who had tried to recruit me multiple times over the years. My family had also overlooked my documented track record of success under pressure. When their largest client threatened to terminate their contract 3 years ago due to quality issues, I spent 6 weeks personally overseeing production, implementing new quality control procedures, and rebuilding the relationship. When their primary supplier went bankrupt in 2019, I identified and negotiated agreements with 3 replacement vendors in 10 days, ensuring no disruption to client orders. When Jacob's mismanagement of a major project nearly cost them a $400,000 contract, I worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks to salvage the situation and actually expanded the order by 15%. The irony was that my parents had just handed control to the one person in the family who had consistently demonstrated poor judgment and lack of follow-through. Meanwhile, they had dismissed the person who had been quietly engineering their success for nearly a decade. They were about to learn exactly how much their furniture had been holding up the entire structure. That first night after walking out, I began developing my strategic response. This wasn't about revenge. It was about demonstrating the true value of what they had just thrown away and positioning myself for long-term success. I started by calling Michael Torres, my former colleague from McKinsey, who now ran business development for a major industrial consulting firm in Chicago. "Claire, I've been trying to recruit you for 3 years," Michael said when I explained my situation. "If you're seriously considering going independent, I can connect you with at least 5 potential clients immediately. Your reputation in supply chain optimization is already established in the industry." Next, I reached out to Elizabeth Hartley, who ran procurement for Midwest Industrial Supply, our family company's largest client. Elizabeth and I had worked closely together for 4 years, and I had personally saved her department over $300,000 through process improvements and vendor negotiations. Our conversation was illuminating. "Claire, I'm going to be honest with you," Elizabeth said. "We've been concerned about working with Jacob for months. He doesn't understand our requirements. He's unreliable with follow-up, and frankly, we've been questioning whether to renew our contract. If you're starting your own firm, we'd be very interested in discussing how you might help us optimize our entire supply chain, not just the piece your family's company handles." I also consulted with David Raynard, a business attorney who specialized in corporate transitions and non-compete agreements. David reviewed my employment situation and confirmed what I suspected. Since I had never been given an official title or signing authority, I had no restrictive covenants limiting my ability to compete. More importantly, since the business relationships were built on my personal reputation rather than the company brand, there were no legal barriers to clients choosing to work with me independently. My documentation process was methodical and comprehensive. I had maintained detailed records of every client interaction, including email correspondence, meeting notes, and project outcomes. I compiled a portfolio showing my direct contribution to revenue growth from $2 a million annually when I started to over $4 a million last year. I documented the specific operational improvements I had implemented with quantified results and client testimonials. Most importantly, I prepared a comprehensive analysis of the company's vulnerabilities without my involvement, including at-risk accounts, pending contract renewals, and operational procedures that only I fully understood. My resource mobilization began immediately. I filed paperwork to establish Sterling Operations Consulting LLC, choosing a name that reflected my focus on excellence rather than family connections. I set up business banking, obtained professional liability insurance, and created a comprehensive service offering that leveraged my 8 years of hands-on experience with operational optimization. I also began reaching out strategically to my network, not to badmouth my family's company, but to let key contacts know I was available for consulting services. The timing was crucial. I knew Jacob would struggle most during the first 30 days, when his inexperience would be most obvious to clients and vendors. Rather than rushing to capitalize on his mistakes, I positioned myself to be available when key stakeholders realized they needed an alternative solution. My strategy was to let the natural consequences of their decision unfold while being ready to offer a professional, competent alternative. Within 72 hours of my departure, the first cracks began to show. Jacob forgot to renew their contract with their primary freight carrier, causing shipment delays that affected 3 major clients. He missed a critical deadline for submitting a proposal to Baldwin Manufacturing, a potential $600,000 annual account that I had been cultivating for 6 months. Most significantly, he completely bungled a conference call with Midwest Industrial Supply when he couldn't answer basic questions about delivery schedules and quality metrics. Elizabeth Hartley called me directly that afternoon. "Claire, I don't know what's happening over there, but Jacob couldn't provide any of the information we need for next quarter's planning. Are you available to help us think through our supply chain strategy independent of your family's company?" That conversation led to my first consulting contract, a 6-month engagement worth $75,000 to help Midwest Industrial optimize their entire vendor management process. The irony was that this project would give me inside knowledge of exactly what they needed from suppliers, making me incredibly valuable to any company that wanted to compete for their business. Meanwhile, the consequences were escalating rapidly for my family's company. 3 more clients called to express concerns about the change in their point of contact. Their second largest account, regional distribution partners, put their contract renewal under review after Jacob failed to provide requested documentation for their quarterly business review. Even worse, Jacob's attempt to implement cost-cutting measures by switching to cheaper suppliers began causing quality issues that threatened their reputation with long-term clients. Dad's first call came on day 5, his voice strained and desperate. "Claire, we're having some difficulties with the transition. Jacob is overwhelmed trying to learn everything at once. Could you come back and help train him properly?" I kept my response professional and brief. "I'm no longer with the company, Dad. Jacob is the CEO. These are his responsibilities now." When he pressed me about helping as a family favor, I simply said, "You made it clear that my role was never official. I'm focusing on my own career now." Mom's approach was more manipulative, appealing to family loyalty and guilt. "Claire, sweetie, Jacob is struggling and your father is under tremendous stress. You know how hard he worked to build this company. Surely you don't want to see it fail just because of a misunderstanding about titles and responsibilities." But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate decision to give control to someone unqualified while expecting me to continue doing the actual work without recognition or authority. I had finally learned the difference between being valued and being used. By the end of the second week, the damage was becoming irreversible. Baldwin Manufacturing awarded the contract I had been developing to a competitor after Jacob provided a proposal that was both overpriced and technically inadequate. Regional distribution partners terminated their contract entirely, citing concerns about service quality and reliability. 2 smaller accounts also chose not to renew, representing a combined annual revenue loss of $580,000. The operational chaos was equally devastating. Without my oversight, inventory management became erratic, leading to both stockouts that delayed customer orders and overstock situations that tied up cash flow. Quality control procedures that I had carefully developed were either ignored or improperly implemented, resulting in customer complaints and returned merchandise. Jacob's cost-cutting initiatives with suppliers backfired when the cheaper alternatives delivered substandard materials that had to be rejected. Jacob himself was falling apart under the pressure. Nina Rosenberg, his assistant who had previously worked closely with me, reached out confidentially to let me know that he was working 16-hour days, but accomplishing less than I used to handle in a normal 8-hour schedule. He was making impulsive decisions without consulting documentation or considering long-term consequences. Most tellingly, he had started blaming outdated systems and unrealistic client expectations for his failures rather than acknowledging his own lack of preparation. The financial impact was becoming severe. Monthly revenue dropped from an average of $400,000 to $190,000 in just 6 weeks. Profit margins collapsed as Jacob's operational inefficiencies increased costs while client defections reduced revenue. Dad was forced to personally guarantee a line of credit to cover operating expenses, something that hadn't been necessary in over 5 years. Meanwhile, my consulting practice was flourishing beyond my expectations. Word of my availability had spread through industry networks, and I was fielding inquiries from companies who wanted to optimize their operations using the same methodologies I had developed for my family's business. My second major contract came from Hartford Industrial, who hired me to restructure their vendor management processes for $95,000 over 4 months. More significantly, I was approached by Consolidated Supply Group, a major player in the industry who was looking to expand their market share in our regional territory. They offered me a strategic consulting role that would involve identifying acquisition targets and optimizing their operations post-acquisition. The retainer alone was worth $120,000 annually, with performance bonuses that could double that amount. The final blow came when Midwest Industrial Supply, my family company's largest client, decided to terminate their contract entirely rather than continue working with Jacob. Elizabeth Hartley was brutally honest in her explanation. Jacob doesn't understand our business. He's unreliable with communication, and frankly, we've lost confidence in his ability to meet our requirements. We'll be taking our business elsewhere. When Dad called to beg me to help save the Midwest industrial relationship, I had to explain that it was already too late. They've made their decision based on Jacob's performance over the past 2 months. This isn't something that can be fixed with a conversation. They've lost trust in the company's ability to deliver. 3 months after that lunch conversation where they handed the business to Jacob, my family's company was functionally bankrupt. They had lost 65% of their annual revenue, burned through their cash reserves, and accumulated over $180,000 in additional debt. Jacob finally admitted he was overwhelmed and suggested bringing in outside management consultants at $15,000 per month to fix the problems he had created. Dad's final email was devastating in its simplicity. "Claire, we made a mistake. We didn't understand how much you were doing or how important you were to our success. Is there any way you would consider coming back? We're willing to make you CEO and give Jacob a different role." But by then, it was far too late. I had built Sterling Operations Consulting into a thriving practice with 3 major clients and annual revenue approaching $300,000. I was being courted by established firms who wanted to acquire my client base and expertise. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I didn't need their recognition to be successful. I had been successful all along. Sterling Operations Consulting now employs 4 full-time staff and maintains contracts with 12 major clients across 3 states. Annual revenue exceeded $850,000 in our second year, and we're projected to hit $1.2 million this year. I've been featured in Industry Week and Supply Chain Management reviews as an example of successful independent consulting in the post-pandemic business environment. My family's company quietly ceased operations 18 months after Jacob took control. Dad found work as a part-time consultant for a smaller firm at a fraction of his previous income. Jacob moved to Austin to work for a tech startup, though his LinkedIn profile still lists him as former CEO of the family business. Mom has never acknowledged her role in the decision that destroyed their company, though she occasionally sends passive-aggressive social media posts about family loyalty and forgiveness. The most satisfying outcome is that I've been able to hire Nina Rosenberg as my operations manager, and she now leads our client relations division. The people who actually understood the value of good work found their way to an organization that appreciates their contributions.